Great. I really want to thank Bruno for inviting me to speak. I'm excited to be here with you guys today. So I'm going to start with a quote from writer, activist, and teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. He says, "If you are a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in every sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. Without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist." Thich Nhat Hanh calls this concept interbeing. He goes on to say that the sun is also in the sheet of paper, and the lumberjack who cut down the tree, and his parents, and the wheat that made his morning bread, and so on. All of these things make it possible for the paper to exist. I bring up this story because it helped me think about systems at a deeper level. I've been thinking a lot about design and what makes it, successful or even possible in the first place. And I have a few hunches, and I think words are a big part of that process. But before I get into that, let's talk about how that paper metaphor relates to us as designers and UX people. Our work depends on many things: time, money, technology, materials, constraints, and most importantly, the lives, attention, and experiences of other people. We participate in and often orchestrate a process that's bigger than we are. Design requires collaborators, contributors, in some cases factory workers, call center agents, customers, tool makers, postal workers, and you name it. And if we look closely, we can see that people are at the heart of everything we make. So when I started writing this talk, I asked some of my designer friends this question. Any guesses? Yeah. So I want to show you a few of their answers really quick. So a lack of clear understanding, lack of clarity, miscommunication, silos, people not wanting to talk to each other. Sometimes we call this politics. Clients not communicating their needs until the thing is supposed to be out the door. Unclear expectations. I like this one a lot. A lack of extroverted thinking. And the way I think about this is not writing or talking with your team enough, or kind of thinking aloud enough before you have to ship something. This guy says, "Same as life, really, lack of clarity," right? Like, stuff is confusing. And this is my favorite, just like sums it up for me here. Lack of communication, right? And I think all these problems boil down to the fact that people are messy, and we need to, share ideas and get those things out on the table, and it's really hard to do that if you don't understand each other. So, we can't ignore people or work around them. Like, we need to be able to understand each other and find a way to kind of share words in the process of design. So I think if we want design to communicate, we need to communicate in the design process. So I've been thinking about, what does communication look like within design, behind the scenes and publicly? And this is my take. So we start by thinking alone. We may be collaborating with friends or colleagues, but we still need to kind of frame the problem in a way that we understand it ourselves. We need to put it into language that we can relate to. And eventually we talk through the problem with our team, and we try to find a way to talk about it that everyone can kind of rally around. And that's kind of where that extroverted thinking comes in. We all kind of have to get our ideas out on the table and hash them out. We may need to sketch or brainstorm or summarize what we've learned along the way through research. But at some point, we have to get all of the thoughts out of our heads and onto paper. And once we have a shared sense of what we're making, we can express those goals as requirements, come up with an approach, and move forward. And all of this kind of messy human conversation makes it possible for us to build consensus and move forward with the design. And then we have a product, right? After choosing a direction, we start to build it, and we can really kind of refine it and try things out. And the product at some point needs to start to stand on its own in some way. And that's a big place where writing actually has a lot of work to do in the interface. Once we're clear on what we're making, we hopefully ship it out if we're lucky. I think a lot of us have worked on things that never saw the light of day. But ideally we get it out there. And as we move through each of these steps, the idea becomes more and more clear and visible, and we kind of, turn this messy human language into something you can actually see and relate to and click and interact with. And this is why I think of design as a process of articulation. We join together to express an idea in a coherent form. We bring ideas to life. And sometimes we're connecting dots or building bridges for users, and that often means being specific about what the product does, who it's for, why it matters, and how it works. We have to trek through a lot of ambiguity to do this. So I just want to call out early that this process is the same process I go through as a writer. I think and sketch and jot down notes. I question my assumptions. I struggle to understand. And eventually, when I have a sense of what I'm doing, I kind of get a draft out there and start getting feedback and refining it, and eventually, hopefully, ship something out that people can read and relate to. So when I say I'm a writer, I work on digital products and interfaces. I'm deeply involved in the design process, and I'm not writing stories or fiction or essays, those kinds of things. So I use language to solve problems, whether that's behind the scenes or in the product itself. And this is why I have this phrase, using words as material. I think, one of the biggest things we can do is actually recognize what people are saying along the design process and somehow bring that back into the product itself. So earlier this year, Matt Jones, who is the design director at Google's Creative Lab and the head of Berg, gave this talk at Interaction 15, where he said, "Writers are the fastest designers in the world. They're amazing at boiling down incredibly abstract concepts into tiny packets of cognition or language." So going back to Thich Nhat Hanh, I believe that writing is part of every design. If you can clearly define what you're making, you've already done the hard work, right? The hard work is not like putting the pixels together or doing the sketch itself. It's actually figuring out what the heck you're trying to do. And since we work across systems and borders and languages, I don't think there's a better way to articulate design than with writing. So I want to focus on writing today because I've noticed this huge gap between writers and designers. And I think it contributes to those communication problems that I mentioned and people on Twitter tell me all about. We're often on separate teams and in separate buildings. We have the same goals and audiences, but we're not seen as partners or equals most of the time. I know several of you were in my workshop yesterday, and I asked, how many of you have a writer on your team? And there were a lot of people shaking their head. It's just like, it's pretty rare. So I first noticed this gap 10 years ago when I was working at Apple, and I've seen it crop up again and again since then. Designers are invited to product meetings. Writers hear about them afterwards. Designers sit close to the CEO. Writers are in the call center, or maybe brought in right before the launch to try to throw some content together. And I think you can probably trace this separation back to how we're taught in school. In the US at least, we're taught to write in English, to think about charts and graphs and numbers and data and math and statistics, and then we draw in art. And none of those things ever seem to come together into a big picture. But I've realized that this separation really, it limits the contributions we can make in design. So when I'm on a team, I always try to sit with designers. I try to sit with the visual designers or the front-end developers or the engineers, whether that's in person or over Slack or IRC. But again, most product teams don't even have a writer. So, there's a bigger problem of the perception of writing and communication doesn't even matter to a product or to a user experience. And unfortunately, I don't think I can solve this problem myself, which is why I'm giving this talk, and I want to share what I do in my design process with you so you can do it in your process. So these are some of the questions, as I've been thinking about this stuff, that have come up for me. What does writing contribute to design? How can you guys use words as material in your process to clarify what you're making and make it better? And does plain language or clear language even really matter? And why does it, And I think some people have a very limited definition of what writing is or what words, do. And so one of my goals is to kind of broaden that for you. So I keep using that phrase, words as material. So let's actually talk about what I mean by that. Words shape our ideas, how we see the world, and how we relate to each other and things. And that's a really huge, profound thing, right? We take for granted every day that we can talk and share ideas, but words are a system. Language is a system. So a designer and teacher, she's from New Zealand, Anne Galloway, says, language doesn't just make things, it assembles and cobbles together entire worlds and all the relations within. And I would say language, makes it possible for us to navigate places and relationships, to express needs and requirements, definitely important to designers, to name and categorize things, and to understand our place in the universe. And if some of you went to Abby's workshop yesterday, she probably talked about making sense of messes. I had the honor of editing her book last year and getting to know her, and I want to quote her today. Abby says, language is the material of intent. Language is how we tell other people what we want, what we expect of them, and what we hope to accomplish together. Without language, we can't collaborate. So language isn't just important to us when we're designing or to the user to explain things, to help them through a process. It's important throughout the whole lifespan of everything we do. And I think without words, we wouldn't be able to design or affect change or make plans or any of those things. So historically, writing has many merits. It complements verbal and visual communication. It's sturdy. It can stay put. It's cheap. If you're working on a physical product, it's faster than airplanes. If you take the time to figure out what you want to say before you ship that thing out, you're not going to have to pull back the product that you shipped out and do a recall, those kinds of things. So I think writing makes it possible to propel knowledge and intent forward through time. And historically, writing has served us as a force of stability. Things like law and documentation, all these things are really there to kind of pass on knowledge and record history and establish systems and kind of create order. We used to write to preserve information and transmit ideas and pass on tradition. And of course, we still do those things even with hypertext. We still treat writing as this product of an editorial process. But I've also come to see writing as, a material in itself, something we can play with and manipulate, something we can change over time as questions come up in the design process or an idea evolves. Writing can be a tool for talking to ourselves when we're still figuring things out, a sort of kind of mirror or feedback system, a way to understand and articulate design. So when we put our ideas down into words, we give them form and we make them malleable. And we bring them out into the light and make them visible for people. And I think that's super important because we can't read each other's minds. We need to be able to examine what we think we know, question it as a group, and then refine it. And that's really the only way we're going to get closer to the truth together. Writers sometimes talk about this idea of casting a sentence. You throw out a line and see if it catches. And if it doesn't ring true, you reel it back in and keep trying. You may switch out the words with different synonyms or move the structure of the sentence around or start over completely. It's kind of like sketching with words. But when I sit down to write, I usually don't know what I want to say. It's only through the act of writing that it's clear to me that I want to say anything at all. So if you want to use words as material in your process, I really encourage you to see them as small blocks and modules you can play with. Write down the words your clients or your colleagues say on note cards or sticky notes or in a text file. Keep track of things that people are saying as they're understanding the product more. And see how those words stack and relate to each other. And I'll show you in a practical way in a moment what I mean by that. Anne Lamott is a famous writing teacher, and she talks about how important it is for us to be willing to get messy when we're figuring things out. She says, "What people somehow inadvertently, I'm sure, forget to mention when we're children was that we need to make messes in order to find out who we are, why we're here, and what we're supposed to be writing or designing," right? And I like this idea of writing as a way for designers to actually figure that out. And it's cheap. You can throw it away. You can just write stuff down on pieces of paper the way that you do with sketches. And, that experimentation is really important. So I'm going to get more practical now and go back to those communication problems that I brought up. And I'll focus on these 4 in particular. I want to share how I use words as material in my process with my clients, and when I'm on an embedded team, it's kind of the same situation. So if I use the word client, just know I might mean your product manager, your CEO, someone that you're reporting to and helping out. And I hope these techniques make your life a little easier. So I bring this one up first because it makes my life the hardest. It's one thing when people have different ideas about what you're making, but it's even harder to make something when there is really no idea, right? When your CEO or your product manager hasn't taken the time to actually imagine what it is that you're doing, and they may not have a clear picture of that in their mind. So this situation is you're trying to design something, but what that something is really hard to get at, right? So you just kind of start poking around it. And one of the ways that I poke around it is by starting with kind of a set number of questions. And I like food, so I call these questions starter questions, like an appetizer. And basically, I just try to get the product lead or the client to explain what it is they're trying to do. What's the business model? Why is this important to people? There's kind of bigger questions that some people don't know how to really talk about. What's your longer term vision? Where do you want to be in 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, that kind of thing. And I think this is one way to help people who either don't have a clear sense of what they're trying to do or aren't a really good leader. It's also useful on teams where there's not a clear sense of identity. So some teams, everyone's working hard, but they don't seem to be bonded. There's no shared excitement about what you're doing. So there's a lot of messiness. So I want to show you some of the questions. You're not going to be able to read it, but this is on GitHub. This is my Tiny Content Framework. You guys can all see this for free if you Google Tiny Content Framework. I basically share some of my starter questions. I share some of the other things I'm going to show you. And these are just basically to help you kind of kickstart the process of making things clear before you get too deep into getting frustrated and not understanding what you're doing. Another common technique is to show people competitors or inspiration outside their industry. And to me, it's not so much about getting the client to express their taste. Their taste doesn't matter. It's about getting to understand how they think and what words they use to describe things. So, for example, if one person is talking about something as being innovative, they may be talking about the way it behaves or the way it looks. If another person is talking about being innovative, they may be actually talking about the business model or the steps a user goes through. When you think about Uber, I don't actually find them to be innovative as an example we talked about earlier. It's just they figured out a way to make more money. So another thing you can do that's common, there's a Randy J. Hunt, the design director at Etsy, talks about writing a press release before you've built the thing. He calls it the who, what, when, where, why, and how of your product. But I don't write press releases. I don't really write to the press, so I find that a little bit tricky in practice. And what I do instead is I like to write letters to people that I know, people that are important to me, and I find that that is a lot more useful in picturing someone and kind of coming up with what I need to say. So I'll show you an example. I'm working on an idea for a second book. It's very personal. It's like a book that I want to edit and design, and it's not a commercial project. So I started writing down the vision for the book by writing a letter to my friend Rachel about it and trying to tell her like who it's for and why I'm doing it and what I want the kind of experience to be for the reader and that sort of thing. This is a total lie. She did not offer to give me feedback on my project. And actually, Rachel never saw this letter. I'm sorry, Rachel. But one of the biggest tricks as a writer is think of someone you know and care about. Like imagine them there, in front of you. What would you say to them? And sometimes the thing that comes out of your fingers or your mouth at that point is going to be much stronger than just trying to sit down and write something really serious. So I took the bulk of this letter and I just switched someone's name out and changed the introduction a little bit, and I used it to introduce the project to potential contributors and an agent, and I will use some similar information when I do a bigger call for contributors. So just know that some of the things you can do in the process can be trash and they can just be useful to you to help you understand, and some of them can actually become part of the communications around what you're building. So let's talk about the second one, which is different expectations. And I think this plagues all of us. So this is like a very common one. Jean-Paul Sartre is known for saying, "L'enfer, c'est les autres," which means hell is other people. But my friend and designer, Frank Camaro, says hell is other people's undocumented assumptions. So I think gaps in expectations are a big enough problem, but it's really tricky when you as the designer have a gap between you and the client, and then you start adding people to that multiplier, right, of like, what are we doing? If you're not clear and the client isn't clear, nobody's going to be clear, right? The user is definitely not going to be clear. So maybe the client is rushing you, or they haven't given you enough information, or maybe some of your team members don't like each other. I think that's a really common one, that either they don't like each other or they're just not used to collaborating, right? You have the marketing team over there and the design team over there, and the engineers don't want to talk to the marketing team, that sort of thing. So this is not necessarily your fault, but it's going to be a problem for you, and there are some things you can do to at least alleviate that a little bit. So if the gap is between people on your team, get them to talk to each other. Maybe do a journey mapping exercise. Get them to talk about the actual concrete user steps that are going to be taken in the product. What words are you going to use in the product? What do you want to describe as the 3 top features, or those sorts of things? I think workshopping and card sorting are really useful in this kind of mixed up situation. And I find that questions are actually my biggest strategic tool. So if things are really confusing, go back to writing good questions and asking good questions. And I would just encourage you to trust the weirdness of the process. So if you do, kind of do a card sorting exercise, there's always going to be the stuff that people say that isn't useful to you, and I think that's fine. Just get that stuff out on the table, and remember that there's going to be good stuff coming along with it. When I'm working with writers, I like to use this metaphor of putting a puzzle together. When someone's writing a book or something, it's really hard for them to think about, what do I need to say now? What do I say in this chapter or that chapter? And I think part of the process of writing and making and designing is actually just going until you can't go anymore, and then worrying about how the pieces connect. We put so much effort into trying to do it right the first time, but it's just kind of counterproductive. So don't try to synthesize too early. I think if you do that, you're going to end up having to go back and do more interviews or sketches and those kinds of things. This kind of gap in expectations also comes up with the public. So if you're on the design team and you guys have expectations about what makes the product great, but the marketing team is trying to sell something else, you have the problem of like making false promises, right? And I think you can solve this as a designer by actually sharing things you've learned on paper. Share your words, share words from the process with the marketing team early and often, and let them really know concrete features and what the thing is actually going to do. And I think that there's a huge gap. I see it all the time where engineers are building something and they don't want to talk to marketing, so marketing just has to like make something up about what the thing does, right? So you need to like figure out like what is the right story. And again, like card sorting can be useful for that. You can write down like main marketing messages and have people decide like, you know, what are the top 3, and that kind of agile, like use the dots or just have everyone like write it themselves and then stack them up and see which ones win, that sort of thing. I've also been known to write multiple choice questions. I'll read you these because they're pretty small. This is from a client that I worked with a couple of years ago called Safari. It's a digital reading service, and they basically have books and videos and tutorials online for people like us to learn how to make the web and that kind of stuff. But they were like, we have the best books. And we were having a little bit of trouble deciding why the books were the best or why the product mattered. And so, I gave them a multiple choice quiz of like, why are they the best? Are they the newest or the most important books? Are they the highest read or the highest rated, those kinds of things. Really just try to dig into people's language, and I think that that's a big trick that you can do when you're dealing with ambiguity. Sometimes just codifying your language can help you out. They also, the third one says, pick 2 to 3, Safari helps me because, and then it's a bunch of things, like it's convenient, it saves me time and money, it's always up to date, it has books before they come out, those kinds of things. And I just try to get them to actually narrow it down to 2 or 3 marketing messages because a product can't do everything, right? And so a lot of figuring out what it does best is actually getting people to make some decisions about that. I also like to do a Mad Libs exercise, and you can do this on paper or a whiteboard. This is, again, really useful with like the person who's supposed to be the main product visionary. This is in my tiny content framework, which I mentioned earlier. So here's an example from a client that it's a mobile app. It's like a photo app for taking photos of things that you find interesting. And you can do this in your own language structure. I'm just showing it in English. But here's an example of some of the choices I gave the client for the noun. Chroma is a field guide, or a visual guide, or a pocket reference, or a pocket guide, or a pocket visual field guide. You can just play with the words there. Or is it a community? We decided it's very much not a community. But sometimes just actually like listing out what those options could be and then getting people to cross some of them off is really useful. And then I also do something similar with actually writing kind of like fake interface. Like, why would I join this? Join Chroma to create a field guide and share curious things you find. These are just like messy examples. This is a very early draft that ended up helping me with a product tour later on. So just get those words down. You don't need a copywriter to do this. You can do this yourself. Just try to use plain language, something you would actually say to a friend or a neighbor. It doesn't have to be buzzwordy. All right. This one may be a personal peeve, but I'm sure you've experienced it. Be wary of limiting language. Absolutes, either or statements. I think anytime we're polarizing something, we're getting into dangerous territory, right? These are some examples that I wrote down at my last big corporate job. The only way to do this is people don't care about anything except that isn't important to anyone, or this page is just for blank, or they never do that, right? So whenever you hear like another person on your team saying this kind of stuff, just know that a little light should be going on, like, design is going to get difficult now, right? Because we really need room to have some, ideas and to have, like, more than one solution. If Brad Frost is here, he wrote a beautiful post about the word just. Just is particularly dismissive. So if you find people using the word just, they are oversimplifying. And you don't have to say it to them. It's just worth noting that you need to kind of like step back and think more about, but what about this, And so here are some responses to these kinds of things that you can say. What about this? How about we try this? It might be important to X, Maybe there's another user type that they're forgetting. Who's in your audience? Like, what kinds of things are exceptions, right? We're not all the same person, and we're not designing for everyone who's like us. So this isn't so much of a writing trick as an editing trick, but I think it helps you make sure that you have the room to do your job when you pay attention to the words people are using that influence your ability to do that and come up with different options. Another way to avoid this problem is when you're presenting design directions, present different variations on the language too. Don't get stuck in one structure in the content, in a wireframe or a mobile sketch. Like, try moving things around. People tend to choose something better when they have more than one choice. And I like to show like 3 or 4, and I usually choose at least one in there that I know they're going to want to see, but it's not my favorite. And by seeing the other ones, it just looks weaker. So just like your design, feel free to play with the writing. Okay, last one. We all know good design doesn't sell itself. If it did, Apple wouldn't spend $1 gazillion on marketing stuff that we all already know about, right? But if you're working on a Kickstarter or a new product, you need to be able to explain yourself a little bit. And whether that's in the interface and a tooltip or a product tour or in the marketing, if you're not working on marketing, again, I really highly recommend sharing what you've learned in the design process with your marketing lead. It's very important. There's so many companies that just don't do that, and it's a total fail. So for me, that can look like the Mad Libs exercise I showed you, or talking about a product tour with a marketing person. But I also have a lot of questions that I like to ask. It's kind of like a spec list for doing design that later will eventually need to be marketed. So these are on my book site, which I'll share with you later, but I'll go through them really quickly. What is it? Who is it for? How's it going to brighten their day? Why the heck are we doing this thing, right? Like, why does this really matter? And I think there's always like the business answer to that, but like, really, why does it matter? What can you do with it? If you're in my workshop yesterday, I really pushed you guys to like choose 3 main things. And you may end up having 4 main things or 5 main things, but if you can choose 3, you're off to a really good start, and you're keeping it to something that people can actually kind of like absorb quickly. How does it work? If it's a physical product and there's also a website, don't forget your 5 senses. What does it look like? What is it made of? Why did you choose those materials if you're involved in that? If you're just working on the interface, like, make sure that you're talking to the industrial designer who's working on the actual thing, Does it pair well with something? Why did you make it? What did you guys learn along the way? Depending on how big your team is, this may be interesting, it may not. I think Slack is amazing at telling stories about how they make software, and Stripe and some of these newer software companies are just really good about explaining stuff and sharing what they learn along the way. What are people saying about it? Share your process, share your competition, like, how are you different from them? Like, share your reputation. These can all become use cases for your marketing team to write if you don't want to think about that stuff. The last trick I want to share is that a lot of people ask me, how do I get started? I don't know how to write about this. The number one thing I do is I record myself. So I write down questions I want to answer, whether it's a marketing page or a pop-up or just the general product itself, like, why does this thing need to be? Just write down some questions and record yourself. I use Siri on my phone. You can use speech-to-text with Siri. You probably have something similar. You can also just record yourself and then listen to it later. Print it out, highlight the stuff that was good and throw the rest away. I think sometimes the best stuff comes right out of your head when you're not looking at the computer and you're pacing around. And I often do that when I'm kind of trying to get started on an essay or a talk or a longer thing. So here's a quick summary of all the stuff that you can do to use words as material in your process. And I think you'll find some of your own that work for you. I'll give you guys 1 second to take a photo of that, and then I'm going to wrap up. So many phones. So I just want to close with an excerpt from an interview with David Foster Wallace from The Believer. He's talking about the gap between ordinary citizens, like he calls them schmoes at one point, and people who work in specialized roles. And so I think this very much relates to us. He says, think of the thrill of finding a smart, competent IT technician who can also explain what she's doing in such a way that you feel like you understand what went wrong with your computer and how you might even fix the problem yourself if it happened again. Or an oncologist who can communicate clearly and humanely with you and your wife about what the available treatments are for her stage 2 neoplasm, and about how the different treatments actually work and exactly what the pluses and minuses of each are. If you're like me, you practically drop and hug the ankles of technical specialists like this when you find them. As of now, of course, they're rare. What they have is a particular kind of genius that's not really part of their specific area of expertise. As such, areas are usually defined and taught. There's not even really a good univocal word for this kind of genius, which might be significant. Maybe being able to communicate with people outside one's area of expertise should be taught and talked about. So I think we have a profound responsibility to do this kind of communication and translation in our work with our clients and our colleagues and our users. As designers, we're often the people defining the problem and coming up with solutions. So using words as material along the way will always make our work better. Clarity moves us forward where ambiguity can pull us back. And if we place our words carefully, we can build a path for ourselves right out of mud. Thank you.